Hi there, welcome. Now, Sense and Sensibility is usually about Eleanor, Marianne, Willoughby, and the rest of the main cast of emotionally entangled favourites. But today, I'm veering off course a little because I want to talk about the ones who rarely get centre stage. You know the type. The ones who drift in, say something odd or brilliant or ridiculous, and then wander off into the background without much fanfare. But if you've been watching this series, you'll know I don't believe that Austen ever includes a character by accident. Even the ones who only get a line or two or do something shape the mood and nudge the plot or quietly hold up a mirror to the main players. So instead of giving each of these folks their own video, which would probably stretch the patience of everyone involved, including me, I've bundled them together here in one big, glorious, underappreciated group. Here's who we're diving into in this video. Mr. Henry Dashwood, Charlotte Palmer, Mr. Thomas Palmer, Eliza Brandon, Elizabeth Williams, Eliza's daughter, Lady Middleton, Sophia Gray, and Mrs. Ferrers. So let's get started. We meet Henry Dashwood only briefly before he exits the story by dying. Some may say, how inconsiderate. But that death is the spark that sets everything else in motion. His passing is less a moment of drama than a catalyst. It unearths the precariousness of the Dashwood women's position and lays bare the harsh realities of inheritance laws in Austen's world. In that sense, Mr. Dashwood is both a character and a device. His death opening the door to everything the novel has to say about property, gender, and the limits of familial obligation. But we still get just enough to form an impression. He seems a kind, affectionate father, genuinely troubled that he cannot do more for his daughters. But he is also ineffectual, too gentle to confront the legal injustices that disinherits them, and too passive to secure their future while he still can. He asks his son John Dashwood to assist his half-sisters, not a command, but a polite request, and this lack of firmness, of insistence, leaves the door wide open for selfishness to walk right in.
You must help them.
Of course.
You must promise to do this.
He tends to be portrayed with sympathy and tenderness, usually seen in a quiet, melancholy opening. But what follows his death, what happens because of his death, is the sharp lesson in what happens when good intentions aren't enough. Let's break down the circumstances around whether Henry Dashwood could have done more for his second wife and daughters. The legal angle.
That the estate of Norland was left to me in such a way as prevents me from dividing it between my two families.
At the time, English inheritance law heavily favoured primogeniture and entitlement, especially in landed families. What we're told in Sense and Sensibility is that Norland Park is entailed, meaning it has to be passed to the next male heir, in this case John Dashwood, Henry's son from his first marriage. This kind of entail was designed to keep the estates intact, passing through the male line without being split up or lost through marriage or mismanagement. So Henry Dashwood couldn't leave his estate to his second wife or daughters, even if he wanted to. It legally had to go to John.
Norland, in its entirety, is therefore yours by law.
However, and this is the key, he did have the life interest in the estate, meaning he could live there, enjoy its income, and potentially save or distribute his own personal fortune separately. And we're told that he had some money of his own, though clearly not enough to comfortably establish his wife and 3 daughters after death.
But your stepmother, my wife and daughters, are left only £500 a year, barely enough to live on, nothing for the girls' dowries.
He could have secured a jointure, like the one Mrs. Jennings had, A jointure was a legal provision settled on a wife before marriage, guaranteeing her a certain income, usually drawn from the property or investments, if she outlived the husband. The key difference with Mrs. Jennings is that her late husband was probably wealthier and, most importantly, had no entail to block him from settling that kind of thing up. The kind of legal arrangement typically had to be written into a marriage settlement. He could have certainly pressed John Dashwood more forcefully with clearer legal language or more structured obligation than just a dying wish. So was he negligent? In modern terms, perhaps, but more passive than cruel. He wasn't indifferent, just not assertive. Austen presents him as a gentle, kind-hearted, and perhaps emotionally overwhelmed by his looming death and the unfairness of the situation. He hoped John would honour his request, but didn't enforce it. Jane Austen writes, "The owner of the estate was a single man, who lived to a very advanced age, and who for many years of his life had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. But her death, which happened 10 years before his own, produced great alteration in his home. For to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it." She then follows this up with, "The old gentleman died, his will was read, and, like almost every other will, gave as much disappointment as pleasure. He was neither so unjust nor so ungrateful as to leave his estate from his nephew, but he left it to him in such terms as destroyed half the value of the bequest." Henry inherited Norland from his uncle, not from his father. That detail matters because it shows that the estate passed laterally, uncle to nephew, due to the uncle being unmarried and without children. Again, classic entail behaviour. Once Henry inherits, the estate must then pass to the male heir, i.e. John. So the reason it passes to John isn't just preference, it's because Henry, as the life tenant, held the estate temporarily until his death, after which he had to pass it to the next male in line. So what does this tell us? Henry Dashwood was already the legal inheritor, meaning that the estate had to pass to him by some predetermined legal structure. The uncle intended to make the Dashwood daughters co-heiresses, or at least provide for them, but was constrained by the entail and could only leave personal effects and money, not the estate itself. This quiet failure of action sets the whole novel in motion. Austen's critique isn't loud, but it's there. Goodness alone isn't enough in the world shaped by law, money, and inheritance. So his legacy then is not just in what he gave or failed to give, but in the chain of events he set in motion. For the Dashwood women, at least, his gentleness was no match for the consequences they were left to face. Charlotte Palmer enters the story in a flutter of smiles and giggles and rarely pauses long enough to take much in.
Oh, what a delightful place. I do love a cottage, don't you, my love?
She's chatty, easily pleased, and seems completely unfazed by her husband's sullen disregard for her, and yet she never appears diminished by him.
Oh, if only this rain would stop.
Only you would stop.
She's not the most thoughtful or perceptive person in the room, but she is warm, eager to please, and unbothered by much of the pettiness and politics that swirl around her. She's often treated as a minor comic figure, and rightly so, but what's easy to miss is how well she fits into the social patterning of the novel. She may not carry the weight in the plot's major turning points, but she absolutely has a function in the world Austen is constructing.
Do you hear that, Charlotte? While you were so busy whispering, Charlotte and I have concocted a plan.
Oh, it is the best plan in the world.
In some ways, Charlotte is a kind of younger echo of Sir John Middleton, socially generous, full of light chatter, and seemingly incapable of brooding or bitterness. If Sir John fills Barton Park with hunting talk and general enthusiasm, Charlotte brings that same relentless cheer, just dressed in London fashion and filtered through nervous laughter.
You are commanded to Barton Park for dinner. But me no buts. The carriage will be sent for you at 4 o'clock.
Which makes it no surprise that many viewers and readers have asked whether Sir John might have been better matched with Charlotte instead of her sister. It's a fun what if, because temperamentally they're almost twins. Neither takes much seriously, both are delighted by company, and both seem impervious to awkwardness. But of course Austen gives Sir John a wife who serves as a foil, not a match, which only makes Charlotte's character pop that much more when she arrives on the scene. She's like a window into what the household might have looked like with a different sort of energy. Charlotte doesn't have a conventional character arc. She doesn't grow and she doesn't change, but her presence serves as a kind of social buffer. She diffuses tension simply by being incapable of feeling it. She might be silly, even a bit exhausting, but she's surprisingly resilient. She doesn't take offence and she doesn't dwell. She gets through life in a kind of smiling autopilot, and that, oddly enough, gives her a kind of quiet resilience.
I wanted Charlotte to stay home and rest, but she would come. She's so longed to see you all. She expects to be confined soon, you know.
When she gives birth to baby Palmer during the London visit, we might expect a shift, a sudden sense of gravity or maturity or awareness. But if anything changes, Austen keeps it off stage.
I cannot see Marianne.
There's no drawn-out maternal awakening, no moment of profound reflection. Charlotte remains Charlotte, a little scatterbrained, not terribly aware of what's going on around her, a little out of touch, but good-natured to the end. After Marianne's illness at Cleveland, Charlotte more or less exits the stage. She and Mr. Palmer leave the house once things become truly serious.
I would recommend the hasty removal of your child, Mrs. Palmer.
Mrs. Bunting! Mrs. Bunting!
And in some ways, that's fitting. The final movements of the story deal in depth of feeling, in heartbreak and revelation, and Charlotte, for all her sweetness, simply doesn't belong in that emotional register. Her role really is to keep the mood from sinking entirely and remind us that not everyone is tormented by love or status or even disappointment. So while she might not shape events, she hosts them. Her home becomes a kind of neutral ground where Eleanor observes, waits and endures, and through that Charlotte earns her place. She's a bit of a comic relief, yes, but also a mirror, showing us what it looks like to glide through life without introspection, and to somehow be just fine anyway. I like Thomas Palmer, especially Hugh Laurie's portrayal. Thomas Palmer is at first glance an easy joke. He's gruff, uninterested, he's always buried in a newspaper and seems almost comically detached from both the chaos of his wife and the social rituals unfolding around him. When we first meet him, he's all eye rolls and monosyllables, a man determined to project complete indifference in everything from small talk to baby names.
That ceiling's very crooked.
Austen paints him in broad comic strokes. He's a masterclass in social apathy.
Oh, I cannot believe it is that far. You can see the place on the top of our hill. Is it really 5.5? No, I cannot believe it.
Try.
But of course, Austen rarely introduces a character just for the sake of ridicule. Palmer's dismissiveness, his blunt honesty, and his seemingly aloofness to all point to something deeper. He's a man quietly refusing to play the game. In a world full of flatterers and fawners, Sir John's excessive bonhomie, the Steele's sycophancy, Palmer is refreshingly unwilling to perform. He doesn't feign interest. He doesn't flatter wealth. He's rude, yes, but he's also sincere.
'Twas you took offer off my hands, Mr. Palmer, and a very good bargain you made of it, too.
What's more interesting is that this performative indifference might actually be a shield. Palmer is surrounded by social theatrics, Lady Middleton's empty civility, Mrs. Ferrers' strategic coldness, Charlotte's exhausting chatter, and his grumpiness comes from a form of resistance. He chooses detachment as a defence against the superficiality of society, but that doesn't mean he lacks feeling. In fact, we're given just enough to suggest the opposite.
My dear Miss Dashwood, I am more sorry than I can say.
There's a quiet moment in the novel when Marianne falls dangerously ill, and it's Mr. Palmer, of all people, who shows real concern. He's the one who steps up, offers to help and stay behind, and demonstrates genuine anxiety for her well-being.
If you would prefer me to stay, I am at your service.
Mr. Palmer, that is very kind. But Colonel Brandon and Dr. Harris will look after us.
It's not performative or sentimental, it's real. And in that moment, the mask slips. We glimpse something Austen loves to reward, substance beneath sarcasm. He even offers to remain behind to assist during Marianne's convalescence. He doesn't stay, of course. Charlotte whisks him away, but the offer matters. It's the first and only moment where Palmer breaks his own routine. And for those watching the Hugh Laurie in the 95 adaptation, it's hard not to picture Dr. Gregory House suddenly perking up at the emergence of a full-blown medical emergency.
Okay, those are the big ones. Cultures will take 48 hours, might as well be post-mortem. We'll start them on vancomycin for the MRSA and aztreonam to cover the rest.
And if he'd stayed, you'd half expect him to demand a diagnosis and rule out lupus with deadpan flourish, because, of course, it's never lupus.
You stash your drugs in a lupus textbook.
It's never lupus.
Mr. Palmer may not have the charm of Edward Ferrers or the passion of Colonel Brandon, but he has integrity. He doesn't pretend to enjoy company he finds tedious, and he doesn't posture for approval. And while he may sigh and grumble about his wife's behaviour, there's never any real malice in it. In fact, the comic tension between him and Charlotte creates a subtle balance. Where she overflows with feeling, he holds the line of reason. However drolly, their marriage may not be one of romantic idealism, but it's oddly functional. He tolerates, she chatters, and somehow it works. He also serves a narrative function. He reminds us that not every character in Austen's world is interested in social chase. Some are just trying to get through dinner. And occasionally, those background figures surprise us by showing up when it really matters. So yes, Thomas Palmer may spend most of his time with his nose in a newspaper and a sarcastic remark at the ready, but he's far from a flat character. He's Austen's reminder that sincerity can wear a sardonic face, and that real care sometimes comes without spectacle. He sees through nonsense and doesn't pretend otherwise. He won't flatter you, but he will save your sister's life. Hugh Laurie's Thomas Palmer is one of those rare performances that hits the comedic mark and completely honours Austen's subtext. He delivers the role with just the right amount of eye-rolling, disdain, deadpan timing, and that dry, razor-edge wit that would later become Dr. House's calling card.
Try.
It's honestly hard not to see the blueprint for House in Palmer, emotionally detached on the surface, intellectually sharp, socially impatient, and secretly decent underneath all the sarcasm. The film is stacked with talent: Emma Thompson, Alan Rickman, Kate Winslet, Hugh Grant, Imelda Staunton, and Hugh Laurie. And for some viewers, that does blur the line between character and celebrity presence. But Hugh Laurie as Palmer, perhaps because he's a side character, seems to get away with it. He doesn't overshadow the character, he inhabits it. He turns Palmer's surliness into something layered, the face of a man who's quietly exasperated by society's nonsense, but still capable of doing the right thing when the stakes are real. Eliza Brandon's story could seem a little dark for Jane Austen. It's a surprisingly gothic backstory in a novel that's otherwise grounded in drawing room manners and emotional restraint. It could almost belong to a novel by the Bronte sisters. It's a backstory that wouldn't feel out of place, say, in Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. Seduction, abandonment, illness, illegitimate child, and eventual social ruin. For a writer so often celebrated for her wit, irony, and domestic realism, this is a narrative that veers towards the tragic, and as I've said, gothic. And yet, it's tucked right there at the heart of Sense and Sensibility, as the emotional weight behind Colonel Brandon's quiet sense of duty. It's not the kind of plotline we usually associate with Jane Austen, who's more often praised for her wit and finely tuned social observation, but here she shows a deep understanding of the brutal consequences facing women who slip through the cracks of protection, family, or fortune. She isn't just a tragic figure, she's Brandon's great lost love. They were promised to each other in youth, separated by force, and while Brandon was sent away, Eliza was married off against her will to his older brother. What follows is not just a story of a woman undone by society, but of a man who never stopped loving her. Even after she had fallen, through no fault of her own, he returns to find her dying, not some grand last scene, but a sponging house, a debtor's prison of sorts, where Brandon finds her, brings her to a proper lodging, sits with her through to the end, and hears her final wish, that he look after her daughter. She dies in his care, not necessarily in his arms, but with him by her side. But that daughter also gives Brandon a second chance, not in love, but in redemption. Eliza Williams, or Elizabeth Williams, is the daughter of Eliza Brandon and the ward of Colonel Brandon, and is quite a powerful presence in the story. More symbol than speaker, more echo than protagonist. Through Brandon's protection, she, like her mother, becomes a victim of seduction and abandonment.
But when will you come back?
Soon. Very soon.
But when?
Her fate is a tragic reminder that even guardianship offers only limited defence in a world so often tilted against young women with no social or financial power. We might assume that being Brandon's ward would shield her from danger, but Jane Austen reminds us that reputation in Regency England is as fragile as the protection meant to guard it. It's Willoughby's involvement with Elizabeth Williams that ultimately shatters his character, not just in Brandon's eyes, but in the reader's as well. Elizabeth is the key.
She had been abandoned by her seducer, and she has now borne his child. Perhaps you have guessed the connection.
Through her, Austen reveals Willoughby's true nature, not merely reckless or misguided, but capable of deliberate cruelty when it suits his advantage.
Willoughby.
Jane Austen presents Eliza Jr. as a character in the shadows, rarely heard but deeply felt. She's youth and innocence misused, the past coming back around in the most painful way. But she also serves as a lens into Colonel Brandon's deeper motivations.
But what is to become of us?
Rest assured, you'll be looked after. I will see that you want for nothing, both of you.
His care for her is paternal, yes, but it's also deeply personal, an act of penance for the suffering he couldn't prevent in Eliza Sr., she alters the emotional texture of the novel. While Sense and Sensibility often dwells on the polite tensions, as I've said, of drawing rooms and courtships, Elizabeth reminds us of the world beyond, that colder, harsher world where consequences fall heaviest on the least protected. Her story doesn't interrupt the novel's arc, it underpins it, something quietly unsettling beneath the surface of charm, danger and sacrifice just out of sight. Lady Middleton is what happens when elegance has no mind behind it. She's polite, fashionable, graceful, and almost entirely without substance. She's a kind of social mannequin, proof that refinement doesn't always equate to warmth or wit. Jane Austen uses her to critique a certain kind of genteel womanhood, accomplished in appearances, but with little real feeling or thought behind it. She invites the Dashwoods to Barton Park not from affection, but from obligation, and although her manners are perfectly civil, her interest in them, particularly Eleanor and Marianne, appears minimal. In fact, we see very little genuine interaction between Lady Middleton and the Dashwoods at all. It's as if her presence in the novel serves more as a backdrop than a relationship, which is revealing in itself. Her politeness is performative, and her emotional detachment reinforces the idea that not all connections in Austen's world are meaningful simply because they occur within polite society. She shows a clear presence for company that mirrors her own shallowness. She finds Mrs. Ferrers's icy superiority more agreeable than the Dashwoods' integrity. And while the Steele sisters appear, particularly the flattering, socially ambitious Lucy, Lady Middleton receives them far more warmly than she does Eleanor or Marianne. In this way, Austen gives us a glimpse into Lady Middleton's values. She prefers decorum over depth, flattery over sincerity, and status over substance. Where her husband, Sir John, is gregarious, chaotic, and emotionally present, even if clumsy, Lady Middleton is emotionally absent. The suggestion that Charlotte Palmer might have made a more natural match for Sir John is in some ways a very astute reader insight. Charlotte, with her silly but warm nature, shares Sir John's delight in conversation, family and noise. Lady Middleton, by contrast, seems merely to tolerate her own children and views social occasions as something to be endured with a rigid smile. Her most human quality is arguably her pride in her children, though even this is laced with satire. She's very fond of them, and they are constantly by her side, but Austen quietly shows us that her affection lacks depth. The children are noisy, demanding, and largely unchecked, yet Lady Middleton seems to regard their behaviour as charming rather than troubling. Her maternal pride appears more concerned with appearances than with forming their character. They are, in effect, miniature extensions of her social self, presentable when needed, excused when tiresome. Interestingly, she stands in contrast not only to the Dashwood sisters, but also to her own mother. Mrs. Jennings may be vulgar, but she is brimming with warmth. Lady Middleton's reserve is not refinement, it's inertia. She is not cruel, nor is she unkind. She simply lacks the capacity, or perhaps the interest, for genuine emotional engagement. In this sense, she quietly exemplifies one of Austen's subtler warnings, that a life of perfect manners and excellent breeding can still be entirely without meaning. Sophia Grey doesn't appear directly in Sense and Sensibility, but her presence is pivotal. She's the wealthy woman Willoughby chooses to marry, abandoning Marianne in the process. In one sense, she is simply the plot device that forces Willoughby to reveal his true nature. But we can read her as more than that. She represents the hard edge of marriage as a financial transaction, one of Austen's central social critiques.
If I could see him once more, I thought if he could see his child?
Willoughby has just announced his engagement to a young woman of fortune.
We're told Sophia is rich, fashionable, and according to Willoughby himself, jealous as the devil. He claims she discovered his letters to Marianne and insisted he sever ties, reacting with wretchedness, passion, and malice. Now, whether or not we take Willoughby at his word, it's enough to suggest a marriage fraught with suspicion from the very beginning. There's no suggestion of warmth between them, no sense of compatibility, just mutual convenience and resentment.
Have you any idea how much I suffer now living with a wife I detest? She knew I had no regard for her when we married.
In that way, she functions as a kind of anti-Marianne. You know, the opposite. Where Marianne is full of passion and feeling, Sophia Grey is calculating and controlling. In the 2008 adaptation, Sophia does appear briefly at a social gathering where Marianne sees Willoughby again. And in fact, I think it's even in the 95 version. He excuses himself to return to the party where Sophia is beside him. At this fleeting moment, it gives us a visual presence that the novel withholds. She doesn't speak, but her placement, elegant, reserved, at Willoughby's side, reinforces the very dynamic Austen implies. She holds social power, but not emotional intimacy. It's tempting to dismiss Sophia Grey as the cold-hearted heiress who got her man. But Austen doesn't vilify her outright. In fact, she offers no moral commentary on Sophia at all, just quiet implication. The real judgment is reserved for the system that makes such marriages logical, even necessary. Sophia may be jealous and possessive, but she's also acting within the very social framework that demands women secure their futures through wealth and men ensure theirs through advantageous marriages. In this context, Sophia isn't a villain. She's a survivor, like Lucy Steele, albeit with more money and fewer manipulations. She makes the marriage the world tells her to make. And she's a reminder that women in Austen's world are not always romantic heroines. Some are pragmatists and some are powerful, even if they remain off stage. Sophia's arrival in the narrative only casts a long emotional shadow over Willoughby. Her wealth exposes his weakness, but her jealousy ensures his punishment. He gains material comfort, but loses emotional freedom. So his marriage to Sophia doesn't just end his relationship with Marianne, it's the beginning of a life marked by regret. In that way, Sophia is the gatekeeper of his downfall. She barely shows up on page, but the power she has, massive. And then there's Mrs. Ferrers, a character who barely appears, yet whose influence shapes nearly every decision her sons make. She is one of Austen's great maternal tyrants, imperious, controlling, and entirely devoted to the maintenance of status and inheritance.
Unless you abandon this ridiculous plan, you will have nothing from me. Nothing at all. Do you understand?
She disinherits Edward for refusing to give up Lucy Steele and rewards Robert for stepping into the role of obedient heir. She has no real sense of her sons as individuals. They are only as valuable as their conformity. Her approval is currency, not affection. She may not change, but her actions lead to transformation. Because Mrs. Ferrers is a painfully accurate reflection of someone who believes that wealth and worth are the same thing, Edward becomes more admirable in contrast to her, and Eleanor's love becomes more poignant because of her. She is one of Jane Austen's most quietly formidable creations. She doesn't rant or storm into scenes like Lady Catherine de Bourgh, but her influence is just as chilling, and arguably more effective. Where Lady Catherine is pomp and noble entitlement, Mrs. Ferrers is all steely control and emotional manipulation. She may not command a vast estate like Rosings Park, but she controls something just as potent, her family's fortune and the futures of her children. So in many ways, Mrs. Ferrers is the embodiment of Austen's critique of power without virtue. She wields her wealth like a weapon, using inheritance and disinheritance as tools to shape her son's behaviour and, by extension, their marital prospects.
Your brother shall have all your inheritance, and you can starve on the streets for all I care.
What makes Mrs. Ferrers particularly interesting is how Austen paints her power as socially sanctioned. No one questions her authority. People fear her, flatter her, and do what she wants, even if they know exactly what she's doing. Her daughter, Fanny Dashwood, isn't a foil to her, but a mirror. Fanny has absorbed her mother's values whole. Snobbery, control, self-interest masquerading as propriety. In that sense, Mrs. Ferrers becomes the root system of a toxic social tree. Her legacy extends into the next generation. She doesn't need to be on the page for long to have lasting impact. She has shaped every corner of the Ferrers family dynamic. Even when she isn't present, her decisions ripple outwards. And yet Austen never gives her the grandeur of a true villain. There's no climactic confrontation, no speech that unmasks her. She simply is, and that's part of what makes her so effective. She embodies a type, the matriarch who cloaks control in respectability. She upholds a social order that crushes sentiment under the weight of inheritance and expectation. In many ways, she's a shadowy counterpart to Mrs. Jennings. Both are widows, both command social space, but Mrs. Jennings is warmth, meddling, maternal chaos. Mrs. Ferrers is ice, cold, composed and unmoving. The Ice Queen from Narnia wouldn't blink twice, and I expect her to conjure up a snowstorm and ban joy from the drawing room. Her presence at a gathering chills conversation. Her approval, or lack of it, can make or break a match. And while she's certainly not the novel's focus, her presence reinforces one of Austen's key themes, that wealth without compassion corrupts not just individuals, but the very social fabric around them. So while Mrs. Ferrers may only appear in a handful of scenes, her role is immense. She quietly pulls every string, especially the ones that make Edward miserable, a wedge between love and livelihood, and a stand-in for a whole class of powerful women in Austen's world. Those whose wealth allows them to dictate the rules, and who never imagine those rules might be unjust. And that is our little wander around the edges of Sense and Sensibility complete, giving some space to the people who usually drift in and out without much fuss. They're not the stars, but they do hold up the stage. They connect the dots, they trigger the fallout and quietly build the world around Eleanor and Marianne. These characters are easy to overlook, but as we know, Austen always puts nothing in by accident. If you've enjoyed this detour through the lesser-known corners of the story, then it might be worth sticking around. You know, the next stretch of this series will be focusing on the 6 main players. So we have Eleanor, Edward, Marianne, Colonel Brandon, Willoughby, and Mrs. Dashwood. I think Mrs. Dashwood will do next. Each of them deserves their own space, and honestly, there's a lot to say. So thanks again for watching, and do feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.